Great, thanks Dave, and thanks Leslie for pulling it all together, and Shiv, thanks for showing up. That's excellent news. That makes the evening go well.
It helps.
I'm really, I don't know about other council members, but I was just so delighted to see the latest intake. You know, that I think we've always had a strong council, but I think the additional perspectives that are coming in now through not just Shiv, but Adrian, other colleagues, you know, it's a great opportunity. Tonight, though, we've got a particular chance to get to know Shiv better, which is great, and it's lovely that it's intended that we'll be able to work our way through other new board-nominated councillors as well. It's a great approach. What Shiv and I, with Leslie's help, have agreed is that we'll work through in sort of three chunks. Firstly, sort of looking at what makes Shiv tick, what's his background, what's his expertise, secondly. And thirdly, we'll talk a bit more, and not definitively and finally, but talk a bit more about what Shiv can bring to the party and some tips and advice and particular insights. And as you'll hopefully already recognise, but will through the discussion, that will build on the knowledge that we have around diversity and inclusion, and Shiv brings some real experience and expertise in that area. And as Dave said, we've got the 15 minutes at the end. We may even have a little bit more. Let's see how we go. But it would be really good if, as we go along, you had to help Leslie out some of those comments into the chat box and questions, so that we can get both questions, but also contributions and perspectives. I think that would be great to see. So, Shiv, we're into the sort of first block of what makes you tick. You know, tell us, you know, in broad terms a bit about your background and how, in particular, did your journey into tennis begin?
Yeah, and thank you. I'm very excited to be here. So thank you for inviting me. I'll give you this version of my background, and there'll be a reason to that, which is sort of connected to some of the questions that we have later on. But I was born in India, the youngest of 5 kids. I grew up in Epsom in Surrey, which I think many people will be familiar with because it's near Wimbledon. And I started playing tennis when I was about 7 years old. I had 2 older brothers that were very sporty, and you know, tennis was sort of one sport that I took to almost immediately. You know, I can sort of remember that first day being on court with my dad, and just sort of kind of understanding what I needed to do, which is a bit unusual. Although actually my game's really awful now, so you know, all these years later, that has not helped. But I grew up in Epsom in Surrey. I did a master's in French language and literature because I always loved languages. So I lived abroad for a little while, and then I did what everyone with a master's in French and language and literature does. I decided that I was going to be this great star of stage and screen. And I did little bits of work in London and abroad. And clearly, you know, that did not work out the way that I'd hoped. So I fell into management consulting in around 2000 with McKinsey & Company in London. And my whole corporate career for the past 2 decades has been in management consulting, and primarily in the area of digital transformation and really focusing on change management. I moved with them to New York in 2005, and I was there for about 15 years up until last year, actually. And for the last 4 years that I was in New York, I moved from McKinsey to Adobe, where I was recruited to essentially to design, develop and productize what is essentially a change management service line for Adobe's digital marketing suite of products. But then I left them at the end of last year because I decided I wanted to move back to the UK. And now I have my own little consulting practice. So I still offer change advisory services, diversity and inclusion strategy and training, and also executive coaching.
Great, Shiv. And in that New York period, there was the specific engagement with the US Tennis Association as well. And was that specifically coming in with the diversity inclusion perspective and expertise? What was your involvement there?
Yeah, it was. So it was a bit of a, you know, me sort of pushing the agenda, I think, to sort of get involved. It was a bit of a roundabout way. So I was playing on a tennis circuit called the GLTA, which is the Gay and Lesbian Tennis Alliance.
Hello.
They have about 60 tournaments around the world, and about
Yeah, I'm on a Zoom, so
and about
I just said to Mike that you were tied up this evening. So
Right.
Shiv, Vicky, thank you, Vicky.
no worries.
Press on, Shiv.
Yeah, no worries. So I was playing on this tour, this GLTA tour, and when I had first moved to New York, so as I said, tennis was my first love, but I actually left it alone for many, many, many years. And then when I moved to New York in around 2005, I started to take it up again. And actually the whole landscape of tennis, right, had changed then. So there were tons of leagues, lots of gay leagues around, you know. So I started playing on this tour, and that was just sort of fascinating to me, you know, all the different kinds of characters that you would find. That was my introduction to the gay games, which I had never heard of, and was this huge affair, which was like the Olympics. And I thought it was really fascinating. So I decided that I wanted to make a documentary and sort of document some characters in this world, although I had never done anything like that before. But I ended up making this 20-minute film about these different characters who play on the GLTA tour, and sort of really what combines them, which is really, it's really community and sport. And then I held a small premiere of that film in New York for my friends, and I invited D.A. Abrams, who was the then D&I head of diversity for the USTA, to join. And lo and behold, he came. And so then after that, he approached me and asked me if they could use my movie for part of their diversity outreach engagement programs. And so they took it on tour in 2014, and they basically showcased it at a bunch of tournaments, the hardcore tournaments that lead up to the US Open. So we would have an event, people would buy tickets, come watch the movie, we'd have cocktail hour, and then we'd all go and watch you know, tennis matches and things like that together. And through that, they then suggested that I join one of the national committees for the USTA, but it was all done with I didn't really understand how the USTA worked or what national committees were or that kind of thing. I just wanted to use this as a way to get people to think about their perceptions, right, of different characters. And so I really, you know, DA is no longer with the USTA, but I really credit him with looking at kind of like grassroots, people who are making grassroots efforts like myself, and using those to kind of further that agenda. Yeah.
And Shiv, I'd be keen to explore a bit further how that learning, and particularly the film, whether it's got transferability and relevance here. But just on that USTA, is there? Did you actually, during that 4 years, get a better sense of how it operates? I mean, are you coming to us at the LTA with some of that insight as well?
Yes, well, I mean, I would hope so. I mean, I served a few terms on the D&I committee, the D&I National Committee, and I started as a committee member, but in my final term, I was vice chair, and I would have run for chair again if I had not moved, back to the UK. But yeah, I mean, you know, the USTA is, I'm sure many people are aware, it's a huge organization, and it's actually quite complicated in the way that it's set up. I think it's actually not too dissimilar to the way tennis is run in Britain, as I'm starting to understand. But yeah, it's a massive undertaking, and I think I was very lucky, actually, I have to say, because when I came on, Katrina then, came on to be president, and she was absolutely fantastic. The chair of the D&I committee was somebody called Patricia Harris, who was the global head of diversity for McDonald's Corporation, and one of the first people in that role to sort of have that title. After her, it was Rene Tirado, who then went on to be the global head of diversity for Gucci. So I was surrounded by really, really sort of a lot of heavyweights in the D&I space, which was fantastic for me. But yeah, I mean, definitely got a lot of insight into how the USD operates. And there are things that they do really incredibly well to sort of democratize tennis and sort of, make it more equal and sort of encourage more participation. So yeah, I very much hope to be able to bring a lot of that to.
That's great, and it'd be good to build on that. And just before, just exploring some more of the things that you can bring to our world here. Just on a personal perspective, what was the particular sort of connection into the LTA here? What was your motivation and interest in coming through this process and joining us on the council?
I wanted Wimbledon tickets. That was my motivation. So no, I'm kidding, obviously. It just seemed very natural. I mean, tennis has been a massive part of my life, my whole life, even when I sort of stepped away from it for a while. But it's a very meditative sport for me. So there's something, I love anything sporty, but I get something from tennis that I don't necessarily get from other sports. And so when I moved back here and then discovered that I couldn't serve on a USTA committee, right, in any capacity, because obviously you have to be a resident there, I wanted to see if I could do something similar here. And I wrote to Katrina and asked for her advice. She put me in touch with David, who put me in touch with Roy, and then met with him. But I think it's you are sort of like what makes me tick. And actually, it's a combination of everything that I shared about my background. But I see myself as a facilitator of change, and actually everything I've done in my life, in my extracurricular work, in my corporate work, and my other kinds of work that I've done, has all the common theme through all of that has been to facilitate change, either at an individual level or an organizational level. And so, for me, wanting to kind of give back in ways where I know I can add value and in an area that I really love and I'm passionate about, which is tennis, I was desperate to kind of explore how I could make that happen.
Great, thanks, Shiv. And I mean, particularly, clearly, that your passionate commitment to diversity and inclusion, and we had a conversation about those words, and I always struggle a little bit when they're brought down to D&I, and it just becomes this sort of almost template implementation of approaches that others may have. I mean, I really valued the last session that Asif Sadiq led, but also I really valued some of the perspectives brought in by colleagues on that session, Funky included, but very real lived experiences like Jay's, was it? Sorry. No, yeah. Anyway, sorry, but those real experiences. But what's your, how would you define? Because when we talked about it, we said the more strategic something is, the simpler it is. What's the real strategic, simple definition that we need to keep in mind when we think about diversity and inclusion?
To be honest, it's the fact that we are all diverse and we all desire to be included. That's actually basically it. Part of the reason I told you about my background and my story is people will pick up different things from what they heard, right? And when you think about the concept of intersectionality, which Asif spoke about in his talk, the aspects that make up your identity, it's really important to understand and recognize what those are. So for me, particularly when people are either trying to attract me as a consumer, let's say, for example, how do they target me? Is it as a brown person? Is it as a British person? Is it as a New Yorker? Is it as a gay man? Is it as someone who loves tennis? And the reality is it's all of those things. But, if everyone on the call really thought about their journey from, how they started to where they are today, and what is it that actually makes them who they are, I think there is some benefit in sort of reframing diversity a little to really understand that we are all complex and we all actually are quite diverse. There's a saying that which Pat Harris uses a lot, where diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. So there's a reason those things go hand in hand. But we can probably all think of times in our lives where we haven't felt included, where we have maybe felt actively excluded from a party or from something at work or whatever, and it doesn't feel nice, right? And at the end of the day, it's just appreciating the fact that our differences, actually our differences unite us, right? It's not the things that make us the same, if that makes sense. So yeah,
that's really powerful, Shiv, and I think it makes a reality as well of the the LTA strategy for tennis, not just the diversity and inclusion strategy, but that whole concept of opening up tennis. The way you describe it, it is, it focuses on, as you say, we're all diverse. I have a particular interest and hopefully a reasonable amount of expertise in disabled people's engagement. But the biggest response that we get when we ask questions about what would work to engage you, it's not about focusing on what differentiates people. It's about focusing on them as a person, but also the opportunity to be part of that whole world of tennis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I would sort of backtrack and say, when I say I think there is some value and some benefit in sort of reframing diversity in people's minds, because when you think about D&I, having worked in change management, organizations, I can say, and even individuals have the same kind of visceral reaction to that, right? Clients don't like to hear the words change management at all. It immediately freaks them out. It makes they think that you're going to have to overhaul the whole organization and really kind of like get under the hood, which of course you do. But I think people have the same reaction to D&I. So a couple of things, one of the reasons is diversity as a word has its origins in a very specific time and place, right? I mean, diversity was really coined when segregation was abolished, and they were talking about, okay, how do you sort of assimilate different communities together, right? But I think a lot of people, when they hear D&I, automatically go to assume things like color, race, ethnicity, gender, and those immediately become sort of a little bit uncomfortable because we are automatically then aware of how much we don't really know, right, about that topic. So that certainly has its place and its merits in history. But like I say, I think it is also worth just understanding that we are all complex and diverse as well. And it's also, it's very smart for the LTA to make that flip, which is more common now, and leading with inclusion and then having diversity follow. Because diversity in and of itself doesn't actually really solve any problems. If you don't have the inclusion piece, right, which is really kind of foundational cultural change, then it doesn't matter how diverse your workforce is or your teams are or that kind of thing. And I can actually personally attest to my last job was probably the most diverse team I've ever worked in. My boss was a Black woman. I was one of the managers on her team. The other manager was an Indian woman, all manner of differences in my team. But it was probably the least inclusive team I had ever worked in, because the culture, there were no cultural tenets really that you could hold on to. And so it actually sort of rapidly became quite toxic. So I think it is important now moving forward to really focus on the inclusion piece, because I think it's something that most of us can more readily identify with, right? And makes it easier to understand.
It's quite interesting that the concept of inclusion versus parallel provision. I came through from the Tennis Foundation. I'm very, very positive about the dedicated, adapted tennis offer that we have, and it is world leading. It's excellent, but alongside that, you've got the inclusion in the mainstream proposition. I was interested when you mentioned the gay games. How would you characterize that? Is that a parallel opportunity for gay people, or is that an inclusive environment? Yeah.
So and just really, really quickly, in case anybody doesn't know what the Gay Games is, the Gay Games is owned by the Federation of Gay Games, right? So it's a quadrennial event. It's essentially the LGBTQ, actually, I shouldn't say that. It's essentially, we call it the Gay Olympics, right? But really it should be called the Inclusive Olympics, because at this point it's the largest sports and culture event in the world that's put on by LGBTQ people, but it's open to everybody. So the name actually is quite misleading, because it's really a truly inclusive event that democratizes sport, because absolutely anybody can come. There's no discrimination at all. But also you register to play. So, you can be in an environment where a sports body like swimming, for example, has actually sanctioned times at the game. So world records have been broken there, but you may, and you can be in an environment with somebody who's broken a world record and you may have just taken up that sport, that year. So it's quite a unique event in that respect.
Right. And that's a great example of as you say, inclusion, and it works in every direction. I think, for example, it's good experience for people to have a go at wheelchair tennis. It's good experience just to be in an environment where you might have a mixed doubles tennis game with people who, I mean, they could be diverse in every sense rather than just male and female mixed doubles.
Exactly.
Great, Shiv, let's just spend the last few minutes before we open it up and look at any other questions and points. I mean, I think there's a real desire to look at how not just new council members, but all council members can bring practical support and assistance to all the councillors, but also to the work of the LTA. I mean, have you got, to kick us off, just a few, say 3 specific bits of practical advice that you'd want to share, or tips?
Sure. Yes. Let me think about that. So I think what I would say off the top of my head, and some of this actually may be familiar because I think Asif gave sort of quite a few tips and tricks on how you can kind of get started. But the first thing for me would be to be curious, right? Ask questions if you don't know. The fact is, we all have biases, right? Biases are unconscious, and that's okay, right? What you do with that is the next step, right? Knowledge is only useful in its application. But if you don't know, don't be afraid to ask. I think we have kind of got ourselves into this state where people are afraid to ask some basic questions for fear of repercussion, or that it may make them look ignorant, or it may even signal in some way that they don't support a kind of progressive D&I agenda, but it's actually because they don't know, right? And I still get things wrong every day, by the way, and I've been working in this game for 20 years, so it's a constantly evolving and learning process. So be curious, don't be afraid to ask questions in a respectful way of people. The second thing I would say is, make an effort to increase your own education of the matter, increase your network, right? Challenge yourself to, connect with people that you may, not have necessarily come into contact with, were it not for the environment that you're in right now. And then the third thing I would say, which is really 2 things together, the brain really responds to just 2 things, right? Images and words. So particularly for, for clubs or councillors working with clubs or other people, you have to really make sure that in your narrative that you're presenting to spectators, consumers, players, families, kids, whatever it is, are your images matching both your words and your actions, actually? Because quite often there's a disconnect for people between what they see and what they actually then observe as a lived experience. And that's sort of often where the breakdown can occur. And that doesn't lead to retention of people still staying involved in tennis and things like that. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I think that concept of images and language is so crucial, isn't it? Because particularly for people who are not yet part of our tennis world, the thing that will bring them in will be things that they recognise in themselves, either the words or the images.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, if you think about it, like as a basic example, you know, there's a constant debate, not just in tennis, but in the sports industry in general. You know, all sports are competing with each other for more market share, right? More players, the next generation of players. So there's sort of been a long running kind of thought that, well, tennis is part of the reason that tennis is elitist is because it's really expensive, right? And actually it's not, that's not entirely true. When you, particularly when you're younger, when you start to specialize in any sport, every sport becomes expensive, right? I think the difference is when you're starting, you might sort of be able to say to people that you can buy a tennis racket that's 50 quid, but then you're looking at material, for example, where it has someone on a court playing, where, you know, maybe they have a whole outfit that costs a lot more than that or something like that. The difference is if you want to play football as a kid, you really just need a ball in an open space. So, you know, I think that's sort of some of the things that kind of fall a little bit by the wayside.
Great. Well, look, we're coming up to 7 o'clock. Let's open it out a bit. And I've seen one or two things pop in to the chat box. Leslie, is there something you'd kick us off with?
Yes, and I was particularly interested to hear that our narrative needs to be in sync with our images. I thought that was a particularly good takeaway for me personally. So thank you for that, Shiv. We have had a question into what difference have you noticed between the US governing body and the LTA? Bearing in mind that you've only recently, you're sort of much in your early stages, but have you noticed much difference between us?
So yes, I will say that with the caveat that I am still getting to grips with the sort of structure and the organization of the LTA and how things are working there. But I think the main difference is just the size of the organization, right? Which would make sense, right? When you think about the size of the US. But you know, you have the sort of business part of the USTA and then the volunteer part of the USTA. And it's thousands of people strong. So, you know, the USTA have 2 conferences a year where all of the volunteers come together. And there's a lot of knowledge share around committee meetings. You're there for 3 days. You know, you connect with other volunteers as best practice sharing, you know, all of these kinds of things going on. So considering its size, I think that's sort of really, really well structured. But they do have, particularly in the D&I space, they do have a lot of support and a lot of like really healthy strategy around D&I. And then they make a great effort to sort of focus and target in on certain sections of that strategy. And they leverage their subcommittees. The way that it works is the volunteer organization has a series of national committees, and then they have chairs and vice chairs, obviously. And then under those committees, you have subcommittees who are then tasked to, you know, execute against all of the goals, which have to be in line with the USDA. So I think, you know, I'm obviously much more familiar with that structure and execution than I am with the RTA right now. So I don't know if that helps, but, you know, ask me in a year's time, I might have a better answer.
No, it's just interesting for us to hear how different national governing bodies are run and structured. So it's just a nice insight for us from you. That's really all. Another question that's come in is some counties have good inclusion and diversity mix on their committees, but others have very little representation. So do you have any suggestions as to what we could do to attract other people onto our committees within the counties?
So so for some of the other counties that are not as diverse, how can they become more diverse?
Yes, yeah. So usually people volunteer for our committees from venues and clubs, but they're not always as diverse as we might like now. So how could we improve on that?
Yeah, that's like the $1 million question, right? And having worked with a lot of other volunteer organizations, and, you know, currently with FGG, it's difficult. It's difficult to find volunteers in the first place, right? I mean, that's always tricky. But I think where it starts with is looking at it's a couple of things. One is sort of looking at the top level, you know, who runs the organizations or those committees. Is there any diversity there? The second thing is, in terms of your outreach and engagement, what does your marketing material look like? You know, what sort of images or words do you have on your collateral material or your digital material? If you don't have a digital presence, you know, does it make sense to have one? And what kinds of things are you posting? What kind of champions are you soliciting or finding, like a change agent program or ambassadors program? I mean, I think those are some of the things that that can help just to sort of change the face a little and show that you are you know, more accessible, or even the kind of aligning with other organizations within your own county, right? You know, can you connect with them and align with them, become a convening body to find out how they you know, how they are able to sort of attract volunteers and things like that, like some of the disabled sports communities and things like that in your county, for example. So I think kind of, you don't necessarily need to always recreate the wheel. You know, people have the same challenge. So I'd maybe look for other kind of organizations in your county that may be doing it well, and just sort of find out how they're doing it, or just sort of start connecting with all of them to kind of best practice share.
And Leslie and Shiv, just to reinforce, I mean, I do think sometimes it's partly about the realization that diverse experience will add value into an organisation. So those messages that go out are actually, people recognise that actually this is an organisation that's open to new perspectives. And I think we've got to go further than perhaps we traditionally have in being explicit about that. You know, the reason we want representation that reflects the communities that we want to engage is because we will be better able to do just that, and we'll be able to draw from that diversity of experience when we're planning our inclusion. And it's just been more explicit about it, I think, sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got another question here. I mean, Sandy did ask one, and it's quite similar. It's about the diversity of the volunteer workforce rather than just counties. So is there anything, I suppose it's following the same sort of guidelines that you've just spoken about, really, even if it's just volunteers in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think those same kinds of guidelines apply. You know, as I say, it's sort of all kind of organizations are sort of facing the same challenge. So, you know, connecting with other organizations to see what they're doing well, or how you can best practice share, I think is one key thing. But also, you know, within let's say counties or pubs and things like that, what kind of research have you done to find out where the gaps are? You know, it's all very well saying, well, how can we become more diverse? But actually, from an optics perspective, that might not look great. But actually, is that really a problem? I think the bigger problem might be if your culture doesn't seem to be inclusive, right? That's something that's going to turn people away. So researching you know, what the level of maturity is, perhaps in a D&I way, and understanding where the gaps are. Has everyone in the club, or, you know, in the county, sort of gone through some trainings for you know, conscious bias and those sorts of things, you know, how to move from being an ally to an advocate, and those sorts of things, in the same way that you might provide trainings around safeguarding, right? You know, are those kinds of best practices being followed? You know, and I think once you start to do those things, that does filter out to the communities. Obviously, community engagement is really key, and targeting different types of places where you might look for volunteers, or, you know, maybe even looking for interns or things like that, I think can sometimes help.
That's lovely. And I've got another question here for you. How about, what would you really like to see develop or change with the game over here whilst you're a councillor?
With the game?
With the game?
I mean, I'd love for my game to improve over time while I'm here. Let's see. I played for the first time the other week and can barely walk. You know, that's a really great question. I'll answer this, and I don't know if this is exactly what is being asked, but I think when I think about the game in general, I mean, I would love to see how the IND strategy is executed. I would love to see that become successful. You know, I would like to see tennis become more democratized, you know, in the UK. You know, from what I've seen and I've read, I think there are lots of really, really great sort of initiatives and things around that which will support that. But I'd obviously love to see tennis be more reflective of the society that we live in, and not just in terms of players or, you know, sports professionals, but consumers, spectators, like anyone who really sort of has a handle on that. And one of the things I'd love to see is more retention. You know, I think it's quite common for people to leave a sport for whatever reason, and maybe never come back to it and that kind of thing. And I think that's a shame. So, you know, we all know that tennis is a sport that you can actually play for your whole life, you know, touch wood. So I'd love for people to get more of that message and see like a really good, healthy retention model.
And I've got a good one here for you. Who is your favorite tennis player of all time?
Rafa Nadal.
Dave might not agree with you, but I think quite a few of us would.
I always want to see Rafa win. So I was very happy with his result the other day. But yeah, I mean, I just think he has such a, you know, an unorthodox style. But I love his fight. You know, very similar to Monica. Actually, I loved Monica. Like, she, you know, never gave up at all. So, you know, I love seeing those kinds of players. But I will say, I mean, I think if there's any sort of perfect specimen or person who was really like built for tennis, I mean, it has to be Roger, right? I mean, he's so sort of graceful in the way that he plays and just makes everything look completely effortless. So, you know, yeah, I love him. So many, but yeah, Rafa, I'd say.
And somebody's asked, what was one of your favorite moments from the Gay Games?
You know, my first Gay Games was in Cologne in 2010, and I really had no idea what that was. I thought it would just be another GLTA tournament, and my friends were like, let's go. But it was actually a very moving experience, and that's what spurred me to want to join the organization, because it's like a full-on Olympics. So you have a whole opening ceremony, you have a parade of nations, you're all in this park before you have to go and march around the stadium, and you see people from, you know, all of the countries are there, you know, with their flags and that kind of thing, waiting to go in. And you see literally like one person from a place like India, for example, or, you know, another sort of, you know, country where those communities are far more marginalized, or where, you know, that it's sort of illegal to just sort of be who they want to be. And I find that very, very moving. I think, you know, within the LGBTQ community, it's quite easy to feel a bit disconnected actually sometimes from it, but it really touched me. And you know, it's a very, very moving experience. I think we're sort of, particularly when you think about the D&I agenda, I think we are made to believe, and I'm talking very generally, that when one community is fighting for rights, it means that another community has to go without, right? We're made to believe that there just aren't enough seats at the table for everyone. And it's actually just not true, right? So I think, you know, when you have these types of experiences where you see people for 1 week, every 4 years, they just want to be who they want to be. You know, when you think about it in those terms, it's interesting to find out why that's so offensive. You know, people ask why inclusion is important, and it's a bit like saying, you know, not having enough of that is a bit like saying, well, you know, there isn't enough sun time for everybody, so we have to like ration that, right? Or there isn't enough oxygen for everybody, so we have to kind of be careful who has it. And then it's kind of crazy when you break it down, I think, into those terms. And yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah. So is tennis in the Gay Games?
Yes.
And do GB compete?
Yes, tennis is so the Gay Games is it's a masters event for tennis. So the GLTA is run like a normal tour, right? You know, you have ranking points and you have like an end of year, end of season championships and that kind of thing. So it's a Masters event. And yes, there are, you know, there are players, they have about 10,000 players from around the world, I think, that sort of regularly compete in those tournaments. So, and I think actually the Great Britain football team, if I'm not mistaken, I think they've won they've won gold at the Gay Games for the last like 3 games, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, lots of good GB competitors.
And okay, so I'm looking at the time-wise here, and I just wondered, just a final question here. Have you been to all the Grand Slams? And if you have, which one is your favorite?
I have not been to the Australian Open. So yeah, they're all very, very different. I'm sure lots of people have been multiple times. I've not been to Roland Garros for many, many years. But you know, I don't know, that's you're putting me on the spot there. It's a very difficult question.
You better say Wimbledon, otherwise you're in trouble.
I do love Wimbledon. I was there a couple of years ago with a friend actually, and prior to that I had been before I moved to the US, and it had completely changed. I mean, I just love how they're all very, very different. You know, Wimbledon is very sophisticated. Roland Garros just sort of, you know, smells of coffee and croissants, and the US Open is just like a really raucous kind of event. But yeah, all very fun and special in their own way.
Okay, I think we've just about done there. So can I just thank you very much for just sharing your background, experiences and thoughts, and to Barry as well for sort of coordinating the interview. It's so interesting hearing about it. So I really appreciate everything this evening. That's been lovely. And thank you to everybody who's actually posted a question for us as well. So that was good to be able to share. So if you want to take yourselves off mute, and if you wish to leave, that's fine. And if you want to stay on for a few minutes and just chat, I can accommodate that as well. So thank you very much for doing everything this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie.
Thank
Well
you.
done.
Everyone.
Um,
Time to let the dogs loose.
yeah, absolutely.
Let the dogs out.